The ocean has a way of erasing urgency. When something goes wrong at sea, it rarely announces itself with noise. There is no sudden collapse, no visible boundary between safety and danger. The horizon stays flat. The water keeps moving. Wind continues to pass over the surface as if nothing has changed. In December of 1872, a ship was found drifting in the Atlantic Ocean. Its sails were partially raised. Its hull was intact. Its cargo was undisturbed. There was food in the galley, personal belongings in the cabins, navigation instruments still on board. The ship was seaworthy. The weather had been mild, and yet not a single person was on it. No captain, no crew, no passengers, not even a body. The ship's name was the Mary Celeste. She had departed New York weeks earlier, bound for Genoa, carrying industrial alcohol and a small crew led by an experienced captain who had brought his wife and young daughter aboard. There was no distress signal, no sign of struggle, no indication of fire, piracy, or collision, just absence. When the ship was discovered, the last entry in the logbook was routine. Nothing alarming, nothing urgent. The final note suggested an ordinary day at sea, the kind that passes unnoticed and unremembered. And then nothing. To this day, no theory fully explains why a competent crew would abandon a stable ship in the open ocean, leaving behind their livelihood, their safety, and their future. Like Dyatlov Pass, the Mary Celeste is not disturbing because of what was found. It is disturbing because of what was left. A ship that should have carried people safely across the Atlantic instead carried only questions. Questions that have drifted unresolved for more than 150 years. And the more carefully the story is examined, the clearer one thing becomes. Whatever made them leave, it made sense to them at the time. The ship that would become famous for its emptiness did not begin its life as a mystery. When it was first built in 1861 in Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia, it was known simply as the Amazon. It was a modest brigantine, not particularly large, not particularly fast, but solidly constructed and designed for long commercial voyages. It changed hands several times in its early years, passing from owner to owner the way working ships often do, accumulating stories that were ordinary, unremarkable, and soon forgotten. Nothing about it suggested legend. By the time it was rechristened the Mary Celeste in 1868, the ship had already lived a full working life. It had weathered storms, crossed oceans, carried cargo without incident. Sailors who served on it described it as seaworthy and reliable. Not lucky, not cursed. Just competent. This matters because later stories would try to imbue the ship with an air of inevitability, as if something about it was always destined to go wrong. In reality, it was a vessel like thousands of others, built for routine, not drama. The man who would command it on its final crude voyage was Benjamin Spooner Briggs. Briggs was not a reckless captain, nor was he inexperienced. He came from a long line of mariners and had spent his life at sea. He was deeply religious, disciplined, and known for sobriety in an era when drunkenness aboard ships was common. He did not gamble. He did not carouse in ports. He believed in order, prayer, and responsibility. He was, by all accounts, careful. When Briggs accepted command of the Mary Celeste in 1872, he made a decision that further underscores his confidence in the voyage. He brought his family with him. His wife, Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia, would sail alongside him across the Atlantic. Their son remained at home to attend school, but the presence of Sarah and Sophia is a critical detail. Captains did not bring their families aboard vessels they believed were unsafe. Briggs trusted the ship. The crew he selected reflected that same caution. Albert Richardson, The first mate was experienced and respected. The remaining crew were German sailors, not drifters picked up in desperation, but men with maritime backgrounds. There was no indication of tension among them, no reported conflicts, no disciplinary issues. This was not a desperate crew taking a dangerous gamble. It was a professional team undertaking a routine commercial crossing. The cargo was also unremarkable, though later it would take on outsized significance. The ship carried 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol, intended for industrial use in Europe. It was not meant for consumption. It was flammable, yes, but it was packed according to standard practices of the time. The barrels were sealed. The hold was ventilated. There was no reason to believe the cargo posed an immediate danger. On November 7th, 1872, the Mary Celeste departed New York harbor bound for Genoa, Italy. The weather at departure was favorable. The Atlantic, as far as forecasts could tell at the time, was cooperative. There was no rush, no pressure, no sign of haste. The early days of the voyage passed without incident. Briggs kept a meticulous log. Entries were calm, factual, and routine. Position, weather, sail adjustments. Nothing suggested anxiety or concern. When storms were encountered, they were noted without alarm. The ship handled them well. Life aboard settled into rhythm. Meals were prepared. Watches were stood. Sarah Briggs tended to her daughter. The crew went about their duties. If there were fears, arguments, or unusual events, they did not reach the logbook, and given Briggs's temperament, that absence is meaningful. Weeks into the voyage, the Mary Celeste was somewhere in the Atlantic, progressing steadily toward its destination. There is no evidence of mutiny, no record of illness, no sign of shortage, no external threat, and then the record stops. The last entry in the ship's log is dated November 25th, 1872. It notes the ship's position near the Azores and describes conditions that are not alarming. The ship had taken on some water, but nothing beyond what was manageable. The pumps were working. The vessel remained seaworthy. This detail is crucial. Ships of the era routinely took on water. Crews were accustomed to managing it. There is nothing in the log that suggests imminent danger or panic. The Mary Celeste was not sinking. It was not disabled. It was not under attack. And yet, at some point after that entry, every person aboard left the ship. Not in stages. Not over time. All of them. What they took with them is as important as what they left behind. The ship's lifeboat was missing. Navigation instruments were largely still aboard, but a sextant and a chronometer may have been taken. Personal belongings were left in cabins. Clothing remained folded. Toys belonging to Sophia were untouched. Food and water were still available. The ship itself continued to sail. On December 4th, 1872, another vessel, the De Grazia, spotted the Mary Celeste drifting aimlessly in the Atlantic. Her sails were set oddly, some raised, some slack. She responded slowly to the wind. There were no distress signals. When the De Grazia's crew boarded her, they expected to find sickness, injury, or death. They found silence. The ship was not wrecked. The hull was sound. The cargo was intact. There were signs of water in the hold, but not enough to justify abandonment. There was no blood, no damage consistent with violence, no evidence of piracy, no fire, no explosion. The Mary Celeste looked like a ship that had been interrupted mid-voyage, not ended. This is where the story crosses into the territory Dyatlov occupies. Because what confronts investigators is not catastrophe, but choice. Somewhere in the Atlantic, a disciplined captain, his family, and an experienced crew decided, unanimously or by authority, that leaving the ship was safer than staying aboard it. That decision is the mystery. Why abandon a seaworthy vessel for a small lifeboat in open ocean? Why do so without taking food, charts, or personal effects? Why leave behind a ship that would later drift safely for days? The Mary Celeste does not present a scene of struggle. It presents a scene of departure. What life aboard the Mary Celeste would have felt like in late November of 1872 matters more than most theories ever will. Ships do not become frightening simply because they are at sea. Fear arises when routine breaks, when the known rhythms of daily work begin to slip. On most days, the Mary Celeste would have felt predictable. Watches were divided. Men rose and slept according to a schedule enforced not by clocks, but by habit and light. The creak of rigging, the slap of water against the hull, the constant low motion of the ship, these were not sources of anxiety. They were reassurance. Silence at sea is not emptiness. It is continuity. Captain Briggs was deeply attuned to this rhythm. He was the kind of man who believed that discipline prevented disaster long before it appeared. His religious faith did not make him reckless or fatalistic. It made him attentive. He kept records carefully. He maintained the ship meticulously. He expected his crew to do the same. Sarah Briggs's presence aboard the ship further reinforces this sense of normality. She was not an anxious passenger clinging to her husband for reassurance. She had sailed before. She understood the demands of life at sea. Her days would have been spent caring for Sophia, preparing meals, reading, and moving carefully through the narrow spaces of the vessel as it shifted beneath her feet. Sophia, only 2 years old, would have been unaware of danger. Children at sea adapt quickly. The motion becomes background. The sound of waves becomes lullaby. Her toys were simple. Her world was small and safe, bounded by the people she trusted most. This matters because it makes panic unlikely. Whatever happened aboard the Mary Celeste did not begin as terror. It began as concern, controlled, measured, and gradual. The logbook suggests that the ship had encountered rough weather earlier in the voyage, enough to damage some rigging and allow seawater into the hold. This was not unusual. Wooden ships leaked. They always had. Pumps were installed precisely for this reason, and crews were trained to operate them continuously when needed. However, the Mary Celeste pumps may not have been working as effectively as Briggs believed. Alcohol cargo created a unique situation. The barrels were packed tightly, and if any leaked, fumes could accumulate. Alcohol vapor is invisible, odorless in low concentrations, and potentially explosive. While no explosion occurred, the fear of one could have been enough. It is entirely possible that Briggs noticed an increase in fumes or suspected that the cargo had shifted or begun leaking. Combined with the presence of water in the hold, this could have suggested to him that the ship was in a temporary but uncertain state. Temporary danger creates a very specific kind of decision-making. If Briggs believed the ship might explode, not imminently, but possibly, the safest course would have seemed obvious. Evacuate temporarily, remain nearby, and return once the danger passed. This theory explains several critical details. Why the lifeboat was launched. Why essential navigation tools may have been taken. Why no personal belongings were gathered. Why food and water were left behind. They did not think they were leaving forever. They thought they would come back. Launching a lifeboat in open ocean is not an act of desperation when it is tethered to a larger vessel. Sailors of the era sometimes did exactly this to ride out danger, staying close until conditions stabilized. If the Mary Celeste had been drifting slowly, Briggs may have believed he could maintain proximity safely. But proximity at sea is fragile. A shift in wind, a change in current, A snap line. Any one of these could separate a lifeboat from the ship it depended on. If that separation occurred, it would have happened silently, without warning. No explosión, no storm, just distance increasing minute by minute until return was impossible. The ocean does not need drama to kill. It only needs time. What happened after the lifeboats separated, if that is what occurred, would have been brief and final. A small boat, even with experienced sailors aboard, stands little chance in the open Atlantic. Exposure, dehydration, or capsizing would follow quickly. No trace would remain. This explanation is compelling not because it is dramatic, but because it fits the psychology of the people involved. Briggs was not reckless. He was not impulsive. He was not fleeing danger blindly. He may have believed he was making the safest decision available with the information he had. And that belief is the heart of the mystery. Because if Briggs had known that the Mary Celeste would remain afloat, intact, and navigable for days afterward, he would never have left it. The ship itself proves that. The tragedy of the Mary Celeste is not that something violent happened aboard. It is that something subtle happened, something that looked manageable, correctable, temporary, until it wasn't. The ship sailed on without them, carrying evidence of their lives, but none of their answers. On the morning of December 4th, 1872, the brigantine Dei Grazia sighted a ship drifting roughly 400 miles east of the Azores. At first glance, there was nothing especially alarming about it. Ships drifted, sails were adjusted, routes crossed, but something about this one felt wrong. Its movements were sluggish, imprecise. The sails were set, but poorly. It did not respond to the wind with the purpose of a crewed vessel. As the Dei Grazia drew closer, no one appeared on deck. No signal flags were raised. No response came. Captain David Morehouse of the Dei Grazia knew the ship by name. The Mary Celeste had departed New York only days after his own vessel. Their routes were similar, their destinations not far apart. Seeing her here, unmanned and drifting, made no sense. Morehouse ordered a boarding party. What they found aboard the Mary Celeste was not chaos, but interruption. The decks were wet but orderly. The rigging showed signs of wear, but nothing catastrophic. The sails were partly raised, as if the ship had been left in mid-adjustment. The hatch to the hold was open. Inside, there was water, more than expected, but not enough to threaten the ship's integrity. The cargo of alcohol barrels was largely intact. Some barrels were empty or leaking, but most were sealed and secure. The living quarters told a quieter story. Personal belongings remained. Clothing was folded. Bedding was in place. There was no sign of a struggle. No blood. No damage consistent with violence. The ship's papers were aboard. The logbook lay open. Its final entry, dated November 25th, was calm, procedural, unremarkable. The lifeboat was missing. That absence framed everything else. Under maritime law, a ship found abandoned but seaworthy could be claimed for salvage. The crew of the Dei Grazia faced a decision: leave the Mary Celeste to drift and possibly sink, or sail her to port and claim salvage rights. Morehouse chose the latter. A small crew was placed aboard the Mary Celeste to sail her to Gibraltar, while the Dei Grazia continued on its own course. The journey was slow and uneasy. The ship handled well, reinforcing the mystery. Nothing about her condition justified abandonment. When the Mary Celeste arrived in Gibraltar, the story drew immediate attention. Salvage claims required investigation. Courts needed to determine whether abandonment had been lawful and whether salvage was justified. That process, intended to be administrative, became adversarial almost instantly. Suspicion entered the story here. Authorities questioned whether the crew of the Dei Grazia had been involved in foul play. Had they murdered the Mary Celeste crew to claim the ship and its cargo? The idea seems implausible today, but at the time, it was treated seriously. Witnesses were called. Testimony was taken. Every detail of the ship's condition was scrutinized. Leaking barrels, water levels, rope conditions, navigation instruments. Everything was examined for signs of deception. No evidence of violence was found. Still, doubts lingered. The court ultimately awarded salvage, but at a reduced rate, implying that something about the situation made authorities uneasy. This partial validation did not settle the matter. Instead, it planted the idea that the disappearance might involve human wrongdoing rather than misfortune. From that moment on, the Mary Celeste was no longer just a mystery. It was a controversy. The press seized on it. Newspapers speculated freely. Some hinted at mutiny. Others suggested piracy, conspiracy, even supernatural explanations. The absence of bodies made every theory possible. The lack of definitive evidence allowed imagination to fill the gaps. Each retelling grew more elaborate. Details were exaggerated. Timelines shifted. Ordinary damage became sinister. Routine decisions were reframed as clues. Over time, the original facts became buried beneath layers of interpretation. This process transformed the Mary Celeste from a case study in maritime uncertainty into a legend. Yet when stripped back to verified evidence, the core facts remained stubbornly simple. A competent captain, an experienced crew, a seaworthy ship, a missing lifeboat, no storm recorded, no battle fought, no fire detected, and no explanation that accounted for all of it. The salvage hearing did something subtle but lasting. It moved the story away from the people who disappeared and toward those who found the ship. Attention shifted from why they left to what others might have done. That shift blurred focus permanently. Instead of understanding decision-making under uncertainty, the narrative drifted toward suspicion and blame. The ocean, however, remained indifferent. It offered no answers. As the Mary Celeste was eventually released and returned to service, her fate continued to mirror the story attached to her. She sailed again. She carried cargo again. But she was never just a ship anymore. Every creak of her hull, every adjustment of her sails, carried the weight of what had happened before. Years later, she would be wrecked deliberately, her final chapter as unremarkable as her beginning. But the moment that defined her, the moment of abandonment, had already detached itself from time. Because the question it raised was not specific to one ship or one crew. It was broader. What would convince rational people to leave safety behind? What kind of danger does not announce itself loudly, but still feels immediate enough to demand action? And how often, when decisions are made under incomplete information, does survival depend less on courage than on timing? The Mary Celeste never answers these questions. It only preserves them. Once the salvage proceedings concluded, the Mary Celeste entered a strange second life, not at sea, but in language. The absence of an official explanation created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed speculation, repetition, and exaggeration. The crew of the Dei Grazia were eventually cleared of wrongdoing, but the suspicion surrounding them never fully evaporated. Reduced salvage awards were interpreted by some as quiet condemnation rather than administrative caution. This misreading mattered. It introduced the idea that authorities knew more than they were saying, even though there was no evidence to support that belief. From there, the story began to drift. Journalists retold the discovery with subtle changes. A chair became overturned. A cabin became ransacked. A calm ship became damaged. Each retelling nudged the narrative away from documentation and toward drama. The public rarely read court transcripts. They consumed summaries, headlines, and impressions. Over time, the Mary Celeste was no longer described as abandoned. It was described as cursed. This transformation did not happen all at once. It happened incrementally, through small distortions repeated often enough to feel true. When later writers returned to the case, they often relied on earlier retellings rather than primary sources. Errors compounded. Speculation hardened into fact. One particularly influential fictionalized account, published years later, introduced details that were entirely invented: bloodstains, violent struggle, signs of madness. Though clearly fictional, it blurred the boundary between storytelling and history. Many readers did not distinguish between the two. The result was a mystery, that BS. The result was a mystery shaped as much by imagination as by evidence. Meanwhile, the actual ship continued its working life. The Mary Celeste was sold, refitted, and sailed again. Crews reported nothing unusual. No unexplained incidents. No fear. She did not behave like a cursed vessel. She behaved like a ship. This fact rarely makes it into popular retellings. The reason is simple, is not unsettling. What is unsettling is the idea that nothing dramatic happened at all, that a sequence of reasonable decisions, made under uncertain conditions, led to irreversible loss. That explanation does not satisfy the human desire for narrative clarity. People want an enemy. They want an event. They want a moment where everything changes. The Mary Celeste offers none of these. Instead, it offers ambiguity stretched across time. The disappearance occurred without witnesses. The decision to abandon the ship, if it was indeed deliberate, happened privately, among people who trusted one another. There was no dissent recorded, no alternative account preserved. When the lifeboat vanished into the Atlantic, it took not only the crew, but their reasoning. What remains is inference. The absence of panic aboard the ship suggests order. The missing navigation tools suggest intent. The lack of provisions suggests confidence, not recklessness, but expectation of return. This combination is what makes the case endure. If the crew had fled in terror, the mystery would be smaller. If the ship had been damaged beyond repair, the mystery would end. If violence had occurred, motive could be inferred. But none of that happened. The Mary Celeste was left behind not as a wreck, but as a question. As years passed, official interest faded, but public fascination did not. The story moved from maritime journals into folklore, from courtrooms into conversation. Each generation inherited the mystery slightly altered, shaped by the fears and interests of its time. Piracy gave way to mutiny. Mutiny gave way to madness. Madness gave way to speculation about gases, weather phenomena, and unseen forces. Yet at the center, the same facts persisted, unchanged. A logbook entry dated November 25th. A missing lifeboat. A ship capable of continuing on its course without its crew. The ocean had preserved the vessel, but erased the decision. And that erasure is what continues to draw attention. Not because it invites wild explanation, but because it resists closure. It reminds us that history is not always punctuated by catastrophe. Sometimes it simply stops. Ships disappear. People vanish. And the reasons dissolve into salt and distance. By the time the Mary Celeste finally met her end years later, deliberately wrecked off the coast of Haiti for insurance fraud, the disappearance had already detached from her physical form. The story no longer belonged to the ship. It belonged to the unanswered space she left behind. That space would soon be filled with theories, but none of them would fully hold. Once the Mary Celeste entered public consciousness as a mystery rather than a maritime incident, explanations multiplied quickly. Each theory attempted to restore order to an event that felt deeply disordered, not because of visible chaos, but because of its absence. A ship left intact, drifting calmly, invites interpretation in a way wreckage does not. The earliest theories focused on human violence because violence is familiar. It provides motive, conflict, and resolution. Piracy was one of the first ideas raised. The Atlantic in the 19th century was not free of danger, and stories of pirates lingered in popular imagination. Yet the Mary Celeste offered no evidence to support this. Pirates did not leave valuable cargo behind. They did not abandon a seaworthy ship. They did not vanish without trace while allowing their prize to drift freely. Mutiny was proposed next. Crews sometimes rebelled against captains, especially those perceived as harsh or unfair. But Benjamin Briggs was neither. Accounts describe him as respected, calm, and deeply principled. There were no recorded disputes, no signs of struggle, no indication that the crew had seized control. And even if mutiny had occurred, it fails to explain why the mutineers would then abandon the ship entirely. Some suggested that the crew murdered the captain and his family, then fled. But again, there was no blood, no damage, no sign of resistance. Violence leaves marks, especially in confined wooden spaces. The Mary Celeste bore none. As violent explanations collapsed under scrutiny, attention shifted toward the ship itself. Mechanical failure was considered. Perhaps the pumps malfunctioned. Perhaps the hull was compromised beyond what the crew realized. But when the ship was sailed into Gibraltar, she handled well. Her structure was sound. Any water in the hold had not endangered her integrity. Then came one of the most persistent and plausible ideas: alcohol vapor. The cargo of denatured alcohol was volatile. If several barrels leaked, fumes could have accumulated in the hold. Alcohol vapor can ignite explosively, even without visible flame. A sudden whoosh of pressure could have occurred, frightening, forceful, but leaving little physical damage. Such an event might have convinced Briggs that the ship was moments away from catastrophic explosion. In this scenario, abandonment becomes rational. Not permanent abandonment, but temporary evacuation. The crew may have launched the lifeboat, tethered it to the ship, and waited at a safe distance. If the rope snapped, or weather intervened, separation would have been fatal. The ship would continue on. The people would disappear. This theory aligns closely with the evidence. It explains the missing lifeboat, the absence of panic, the lack of personal belongings taken, and the ship's intact condition. It does not require madness, violence, or conspiracy. Its weakness lies in what cannot be proven. No explosion was recorded. No scorch marks were found. The vapor would have dissipated long before inspection. What remains is plausibility without confirmation. Other natural explanations followed: waterspouts, rogue waves, sudden weather shifts. Yet none were recorded in nearby logs. The weather in the region was not unusually severe. And again, these explanations struggle to justify complete abandonment without damage. Psychological explanations emerged as well. Some speculated that Briggs, under stress, misjudged the situation, that fear magnified risk, that authority combined with uncertainty produced a catastrophic decision. This idea is uncomfortable because it suggests that competence is not immunity, that experience can sometimes narrow rather than expand perspective. Still others reached for the supernatural. Sea monsters, ghost ships, time distortions. These explanations endure not because they are credible, but because they provide emotional closure. They replace ambiguity with spectacle. But spectacle was never part of the original event. What makes the Mary Celeste unsettling is precisely its restraint. No screams were heard. No wreckage was found. No final message was left behind. The story ends mid-sentence. Each theory explains a portion of the evidence while failing to account for the whole. Human violence explains motive but not absence. Mechanical failure explains concern but not outcome. Natural phenomena explain danger but not decision-making. The alcohol vapor theory comes closest to coherence, yet even it relies on a chain of assumptions that cannot be verified. And so the mystery remains suspended. This suspension is not accidental. It is structural. The Mary Celeste exists in a narrow space between catastrophe and normalcy. Too orderly to be disaster. Too empty to be routine. It forces us to confront how fragile judgment becomes when information is incomplete and stakes are high. At sea, there are no second opinions. No external validation. Decisions are made with limited data and immediate consequences. Once made, they cannot be undone. If the crew of the Mary Celeste made the wrong decision for the right reasons, history would have no way of correcting them. That possibility that everything made sense until it didn't is what keeps the case alive. The ship did not betray them. The ocean did not rage. The danger may have been invisible, and the response, tragically, irreversible. As the decades passed, the Mary Celeste stopped being treated as a problem to be solved and started being treated as a symbol. This shift matters because symbols are resistant to correction. Once an event becomes symbolic, it no longer needs accuracy to survive. It needs only repetition. Each generation returned to the story with new tools and new anxieties. Where earlier readers imagined mutiny or piracy, later audiences imagined chemical reactions, psychological collapse, or unseen environmental forces. The facts remained unchanged, but the interpretations adapted to fit contemporary fears. In the early 20th century, technological explanations gained popularity. Advances in chemistry made the alcohol vapor theory more convincing. Writers emphasized the volatility of the cargo, the possibility of pressure buildup, the danger of ignition without flame. These explanations felt modern, rational, scientific. And yet, even as science improved, certainty did not. Scientific explanations often assume that people behave predictably in the presence of risk. But real decision-making, especially in isolation, rarely follows models. Stress alters perception. Authority suppresses dissent. Experience can produce confidence that borders on rigidity. If Briggs believed the ship was becoming unsafe, his crew would likely have trusted his judgment. His wife would have trusted him. His daughter would have followed wherever she was carried. There would have been no debate recorded. No dissent preserved. Consensus would have formed quietly. This silence is often misinterpreted as mystery. In reality, it may simply be trust. Other theories attempt to break this trust. They suggest conflict, perhaps between Briggs and his crew, perhaps between officers. But nothing in the surviving evidence supports this. No personal items indicate preparation for conflict. No written records suggest strain. The ship's orderliness argues against chaos. The absence of chaos, paradoxically, is what invites increasingly elaborate explanations. People struggle to accept that something so consequential could arise from something so ordinary? Historians and maritime experts have repeatedly pointed out that abandonment at sea was not unheard of. Ships were left when crews believed conditions were deteriorating beyond control. What is unusual about the Mary Celeste is not abandonment itself, but the ship's continued survival afterward. This creates a false impression of error. We judge the decision by its outcome, not by the information available at the time. If the ship had sunk shortly after abandonment, the crew's decision would appear prudent. Their disappearance would still be tragic, but not mysterious. The ship's endurance is what condemns the decision in hindsight. This inversion, where survival becomes incriminating, is deeply unsettling. The ocean preserves the wrong evidence. As storytelling took over from investigation, writers increasingly treated the Mary Celeste as a ghost ship, stripping away the human context. Crews became faceless. The captain became abstract. The family disappeared from the narrative entirely, replaced by atmosphere and speculation. This dehumanization made the story easier to retell, but harder to understand, because the truth, whatever it was, lived in human judgment, not in storms, not in monsters, not in curses, but in a moment when experienced people weighed risk against uncertainty and chose the option that felt safest. The enduring discomfort comes from recognizing how easily that calculation can fail. The Mary Celeste does not frighten us because of what might have happened aboard. It frightens us because it suggests that safety is sometimes a matter of timing rather than wisdom. The ship drifted on, empty, long after its people were gone. It became a floating contradiction, proof that danger can be misjudged without malice or madness. That contradiction resists resolution, and so the theories persist, not because they are convincing, but because none of them fully erased doubt. Each leaves behind unanswered questions, small gaps where certainty should be. Those gaps are where the story lives. By the time the Mary Celeste was finally removed from active memory as a working ship, her disappearance had already outgrown the facts that created it. She no longer belonged to maritime history alone. She had entered the realm of story, where accuracy competes with meaning, and where mystery is valued not for its solvability, but for its endurance. The ship herself continued to sail for years after the abandonment. She passed through different owners, carried new cargoes, and hosted new crews. None of them reported strange occurrences. None described fear or unease. The Mary Celeste did not behave like a vessel marked by tragedy. She behaved like wood, canvas, and iron responding to wind and water. This detail is often overlooked. It does not fit the narrative people want. Eventually, in 1885, the ship met an unceremonious end. Her final captain deliberately ran her aground off the coast of Haiti in an attempt to commit insurance fraud. The scheme failed. The ship was stripped and left to decay. There was no dramatic sinking, no final misteri, no echo of the disappearance that had made her famous. And yet, long after her hull broke apart, the story remained intact. What gives the Mary Celeste its staying power is not fear, but restraint. There is no single image of horror associated with her. No finale scream. No wreckage strewn across the sea. Instead, there is the quiet image of a ship still doing what it was built to do, moving forward, while its people are gone. That image resists closure. In many mysteries, resolution comes from discovery. A body, a confession, a document. Something that anchors speculation to certainty. The Mary Celeste offers none of these. It provides evidence that is complete enough to provoke explanation, but incomplete enough to prevent confirmation. This balance is rare. It forces us to confront how often we confuse outcome with error. We look at the empty ship and assume a mistake was made because we know what happened next. But the people aboard the Mary Celeste did not know what would happen next. They acted without the benefit of hindsight, under conditions that felt immediate and real. Their disappearance may not have been the result of panic, madness, or violence. It may have been the result of caution. That possibility is deeply uncomfortable because it suggests that doing the reasonable thing can still lead to irreversible loss. That judgment, even when grounded in experience and care, can fail when information is incomplete. That safety is not guaranteed by competence. The Mary Celeste does not accuse anyone. It does not warn. It does not explain. It simply drifts. Over time, the mystery has been retold in countless forms. Books, essays, lectures, documentaries. Each retelling attempts to stabilize it, to give it a center of gravity. But the story resists being pinned down. It moves instead through implication and silence. Silence is the key. No final entry in the logbook describes fear. No note explains a decision. No witness records dissent or debate. The absence of explanation does not feel like concealment. It feels like loss. Loss of context. Loss of perspective. Loss of the moment when everything still made sense. At sea, distance erases evidence quickly. Wind smooths water. Salt consumes material. Even memory degrades. What remains is shape without detail, a pattern that invites meaning but refuses specificity. The Mary Celeste has become one of those patterns. Not a ghost ship in the supernatural sense, but in a historical one. A presence defined by what is missing rather than what is found. Perhaps the most honest way to understand the case is not as a puzzle waiting to be solved, but as a reminder of how thin the line is between continuity and disappearance. One moment, life follows routine. The next, it deviates quietly, without spectacle, without warning. And when that deviation happens far from shore, it leaves little behind. The ocean does not testify. It does not preserve intention. It only carries forward what remains afloat. The Mary Celeste carried on without her people, and in doing so, preserved their absence more clearly than their presence ever could have. That is why the story endures. Not because it promises revelation, but because it ends where certainty dissolves, in open water, under an indifferent sky, with questions that were never meant to survive as long as they have. And when the sea finally closed over the last traces of the ship, it did not take the mystery with it. It left it drifting, quiet, unresolved, and unfinished.